We have the great honor to have Professor Sophia McClennen with us. She is a professor of international affairs and comparative literature at Penn State University. She graduated from Duke University some time ago, and we are very honored and super pleased of all her work and the way she has been thinking about Latin America from a very new perspectives. She's professor of international affairs and comparative literature and the founding director of Penn State Center for Global Studies. That is also a Title VI FLAS Center. And she has ties to the Department of Spanish and Women's Studies. She has published 11 books and has 2 in process. Her most recent monograph on issues of Latin America is Globalisation and Latin American Cinema Towards a New Critical Paradigm. It's a 2018 book that my students had been checking in and out, and very happy of learning so much from this perspective. Sophia graduated from Duke University with a PhD in 1995. And she also worked closely when she was a graduate student on this festival that we are having these days. Then for us, it's a great pleasure to have Professor McClennen with a keynote speaker. Thank you very much for joining us. And now the floor is yours. I just want to remind you all that at 7 p.m. we'll start officially the North Carolina Latin American Film Festival in its 35th edition, 35 years. With a special presentation of La Historia Oficial. You have to jump out of this meeting and get into the other meeting to access the streaming of the film at 7 p.m. Thank you so much, Professor McClennen. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much for the kind welcome. And it's, as Miguel mentioned, sort of a huge honor for me to be a part of this festival. It had a major impact on my formation as a scholar. So I also have the good fortune to be able to share a little bit of the research that I started back when I was a grad student. The funny thing about this project that became the book that finally came out in 2018 was that I did start working on it as a grad student. And it was, in fact, this film festival that had a big impact on it. But folks might laugh because at the time, one of my mentors was Fred Jameson. And I told him that I wanted to do my dissertation on films. And he said not to. He said I should write about books and save the film project for a later book. So luckily, I took his advice, because what happened was that the series of questions that framed the worries and anxieties I had as a grad student, and that affected, scholarship in general during the mid to late 90s, ended up not being the right kinds of things, I think, to worry about. So somewhere along the lines when we started thinking about the rise of globalization, the change in the nation state, and the kind of how this would affect culture, we sort of bundled concerns over cultural homogenization and cultural imperialism with worries that neoliberal capitalism would sort of disrupt cultural production in ways that would affect diversity. And so in the in conversations at the time about film, we just figured, okay, everyone is going to watch Hollywood, and there won't be any movies from Latin America that are seen in any kind of significant ways. But what happened was that by having 25 years to look back on, I could look at the fact that the questions that we were asking at the time and the worries that we had weren't they just weren't right. What my book shows is that neoliberal capitalism was just as devastating as we imagined it might be, but that it had this uncanny effect on the culture industry, actually making it possible for a number of Latin American nations to develop some of their strongest film markets ever. And that even within that, we saw a great rise in films of political significance. So for the first time in Latin American history, a socially significant cinema was successful in global markets, at home, and with awards. Of course, everyone's aware of the ways in which Latin Americans dominated the Academy Awards. So it wasn't true until the global era that we had this weird dialectical tension, which was that global capital was upending the daily lives of Latin Americans at unprecedented levels at exactly the same time that Latin American filmmakers were able to have the highest success they'd ever had at telling that story to the world. And so trying to make sense of that book, of all of that, is what this book is about. And I'll just note that the book is super expensive, and hypothetically, if somebody emailed me and they were just curious if I had a PDF, they could maybe get a copy for free. Somehow I can't seem to support the idea that these books we write are impossible to afford. Anyway, so the subtitle of my book is Toward a New Critical Paradigm. And the basic idea was that I wanted to not just say, oh, the questions we're asking are wrong, but then try to figure out which are the questions that we should be asking. And so I played on the idea of that instructions are not included, which is a bit of a nod to this absolutely awful movie that came out at about the time that I was sort of finishing up the book. And the movie itself is a really interesting case because it was released in a normal scenario. I'd ask people to raise their hands and tell me if they'd seen it. So maybe you can find some way to chat at me and let me know if you do have this movie in your archive. Anyway, the weird thing about this movie was that it was released in the United States before it was released in Mexico. It stars a relatively well-known Mexican actor who generally plays characters that are comedic. And it grossed over 42.7 million in 8 weeks in the US. And at the time that I wrote the book, it was the 4th highest grossing foreign film in the United States. And it seemed clear at that time that it was sort of showing us that some of the models that we'd used to understand Latin American cinema were no longer in play. But again, I don't want to dwell on that movie too much because it's such a bad movie and it really isn't in line with the sorts of content that I focused on for my study. But it sort of offered a framework. And so what I did then was think about how sorts of antagonisms that had structured a lot of the research on the effects of globalization on culture were tensions and antagonisms that weren't productive and useful for us. So I just sort of want to walk through what these are to the extent that they then influenced, I think, a lot of research on Latin American film. So the first one is this question of homogenization versus heterogeneity and diversity. When I was a grad student at Duke, this was a common assumption we made, right? Which was that basically heterogeneity and diversity were inherently better and homogenization was bad, and that capitalism was moving us towards homogenization. The thing we couldn't anticipate and that we can see very clearly now is that neoliberalism, in fact, encourages diverse consumption, and that what neoliberalism wants us to do as we scroll through Netflix is never stop consuming, but it doesn't mind if we consume a humongous array of products. So what happened was that I'm able to show in the book that progressive politics and neoliberal practices both support diversity. So the sort of answer here isn't diversity, the answer is what type. And the other problem that this sort of addresses is this idea that cultural imperialism and economic imperialism go hand in hand. And this, of course, emanates from much post-colonial theory, but the trouble is that we were missing the fact that neoliberal capitalism would market against itself if it could sell. And so the sort of traditional structures that we'd use to think about how economic imperialism and cultural imperialism went hand in hand started to break down, and I argue that we need to move past that. The other thing that was really common, I still remember the day that I learned the word autochthonous, was that there was this sense that the local was just an inherently privileged category over, these sorts of versions of cultural imperialism. The trouble, as we could see with the rise and shift in the film industry, was that we really didn't want to mark all local culture. And so you have the kind of weird scenario where you have films like Children of Men or The Constant Gardener, both, again, directed by Latin Americans and within a Hollywood model, that are much more complex, interesting films to analyze than some of the sort of, crappy movies you could see that would be made wholly within Mexico or Brazil or wherever. So I think that breakdown becomes a lot easier to dismantle, again, in the global era where there is so much more content. The other sort of paradigm that we had was this idea of US market dominance, again, as a marker of what's wrong with globalization. The trouble is that during this period of time that I studied from 1990 to 2015, US market dominance really started to shift. And in some ways it shifted really notably towards Asia. And that was a process that became very difficult for certain scholars to analyze because, again, of the models that we worked on that were derived so deeply from post-colonial cartographies, right? To go back to what Gustavo was talking about in mappings. The top movie theater chain in the United States is AMC, and that's owned by the Chinese. So, or for example, the Batman trilogy is owned by the Chinese. So we were sort of missing the fact that this was a significant presence. Folks write about Sony and the power, for example, of Sony, especially in Brazil, but that's really not the United States. And so my book really unpacks a lot of those associations. And then it puts on the map something that I'll talk about a little bit later more, the fact that within Latin America, you started to have some massive media powerhouses too, not the least of which is Cinépolis, the Mexican theater chain, which is the #4 largest movie theater chain in the world. So again, I was trying to ask questions about how we could understand that. The other question that I was trying to unpack and move away from was this idea of how we tended to connect particular aesthetic practices with Hollywood. And so much of the question is, were Latin Americans, right, appropriating Hollywood aesthetics, or were they the source of its influence and tracing those sort of anxieties of influence? It seemed very clear in the period that I was studying that dynamic was almost impossible to unravel, in large part because of the significant movement of talent and creativity that got so much more intense during the global era. We all are familiar, for example, with the fact that, say, Cuban filmmakers were being trained in Rome And we know these backstories, but this particular period of cross-pollination got much more intense, and I think sort of troubled some of those lines of research. And then the next piece that was super important to me to sort of analyze was this question of national culture versus global culture. And this goes back to issues of anxieties over sort of national sovereign efforts to control and protect culture against global influence. And to, as one example, right, I pull out the film El Hijo de la Novia, which was produced by Patagonic, which at the time was partially owned by both Disney and Telefonica, and was directed by Juan Jose Campanella, who trained at NYU and generally had most of his career in the US working on TV. And this particular film is nominated for an Academy Award as Best Foreign Film and as an Argentine film. And so these kinds of questions, I think, got very troubled in the global era, although, you know, there's a long history of it. And then the last thing that I was interested in sort of unpacking was this question about how we sort of tended to imagine that the consumption of particular types of cultural products and exposure to certain cultures would change the way people think about them. And it turns out that that's not enough, right? So along the lines of this argument, I looked at the fact that in the period I was analyzing, salsa overtook ketchup as the #1 US condiment at exactly the same time, or as at the same time that Spanish was the #1 second language studied in the US. We had examples of people watching telenovelas and increasing their consumption of Latin American Latino culture at the exact same time that we saw a massive increase in anti-immigration laws. Hate crimes went up against Latinos. And so there's other examples in my book that talk about how consumption of culture doesn't necessarily lead to any kind of social equity or cross-cultural respect, that really isn't quite enough to advance the conversation in the ways we might want. So these were the things that I was trying to kind of move away from in the book. And so I basically suggest that the geographical markers that we tended to use to think about globalization, which of course should make sense, got unpacked exactly when things became so global that those sorts of mappings no longer were as useful and helpful for us. So the mapping of economic power, cultural power, and social injustice just didn't have that north-south flow that tended to structure a lot of the work we'd done. And so I tried to move away from a model that was geographically based towards one that had sort of the kinds of ethical questions, political questions that I think are what drives a lot of our research, which was to say, you know, the global capitalist market economy is and continues to be a site of injustice, but the solutions to it are not things we can find in a particular kind of geographic structure. The other thing that I was able to analyze was the fact that the winners and losers of globalization, even though they could mostly be mapped according to imperialist geographies, couldn't entirely be mapped that way anymore. And then what we saw instead was that the homogenization of globalization that we worried about when I was a grad student in the 90s was the homogenization of a monoculture of capital, but not the loss of cultural specificity and diversity that we thought would go with that. And so what that does is it leads me to kind of bring about, again, a critique of what I call false solutions that tend to be used to sort of imagine the antidote to the negative effects of global capital. And the first is, I argue that market think, as in the struggle for market share itself, is not inherently ethical. And we think about this a lot in cinema because it does have, you know, relevance for when we're talking about whether or not you want to protect screen time in theaters or have some sort of national regulations. I'm not saying we shouldn't have that, but I want to recognize that that won't be enough to solve the problems that I think we share as concerns. The other was, again, quota-think in the sense that struggling for diversity without sort of an ethical side can lead to tokenism. As I mentioned, geography think, which is the struggle to value the local, doesn't necessarily address the deep problems of globalization. And then the last one is what I call deconstruction think, which means that many of the practices that were considered radical deconstructions in the 90s are now openly and unabashedly used by the market logics of neoliberalism. So they then require us to become a little more sophisticated in how we think about it. So the book itself is divided into two sections, one on process, and it looks at globalization as a process, and then the second on place. And in that part, I look at the three largest film industries in Latin America. And then in the final coda, which I'll give a teaser to, I look at Runaway Productions and ask whether Titanic's a Mexican movie. So just to kind of give you a little bit of a taste, again, I'm going to try not to talk too long and hopefully get some time for questions. The section on process is really deeply interested in analyzing flows of globalization and making the case that the colonial patterns of influence were truly destabilized in the global era. And so this section sort of has as its core 5 key arguments. The first is that the era of millennial globalization brought on a significant shift in the way globalization works. Most importantly, it signaled the end of primitive accumulation, which meant that there were no longer spaces outside of the market. This becomes extremely important, I think, because you can no longer sort of romanticize these places that aren't fully incorporated into the global market. The second argument is that one of the most noteworthy changes is the new ways that the previous distinctions between local, global, and transnational signify. I argue that in today's market reality, for example, the transnational and the local can be mutually reinforcing, especially when the local is marketed as the surplus value of exotic fetish in the global market and as identity reinforcing at home. So there's 2 things happening in ways that I think make it very difficult to give sort of blanket assumptions about how these cultural representations work. The third argument is that the new reality of the power of Hollywood product to dominate the globe, not only in the developing world, but virtually everywhere, meant that alliances were formed between former colonizers and colonies in ways that both continue and disrupt patterns of colonial hegemony. So, for example, the ties between Europe and Latin America in terms of the film industry were not simply an extension of neo-imperialism, because both regions had a common enemy in Hollywood. And I'll give you some teasers of data I use to prove what I'm talking about. Also, at the same time, Hollywood developed its own indie and foreign market niches, meaning that there were times when a film seemed to be an independent film or from independent media, it was actually just a subsidiary of Hollywood major. Or as in the case of the movie El Hijo de la Novia, right? Disney's invested in that. So it becomes extremely difficult when you start following the money to sort of determine projects that you think are better or less sort of involved in capitalism than others. The fourth argument was that despite the turn toward market mentalities, the global era has seen a number of commercially successful social issue films, what some have pejoratively dubbed issue-tainment films, that I actually argue can be analyzed as simply the whitewashing of political, that I argue cannot be analyzed as simply the whitewashing of politically significant filmmaking. And in fact, La Historia Oficial, which will be screened in moments, is a perfect example of this. I sort of say that it's a mistake not to see these films within a larger context of political filmmaking. And then the last argument I make in the section on process is that one of the best ways to disentangle the new web of connections brought on by millennial globalization is to think critically about how this new constellation of connections calls for revised approaches to assessing ethical and political critique. And I point to the fact that it becomes very interesting that neoliberalism is comfortable funding films that directly critique neoliberalism and its ideologies. And that, I think, is a really substantial shift. So the chapters in this section then look at the three major processes that are critical to filmmaking, the first being co-productions. One of the things that I found really interesting in my research was how many scholars really focus on co-productions in Latin America as a negative thing. And that's because we think of the investment of capital as an example, not just of hegemony, but of cultural influence and control. What's sort of fascinating about this, when you drill in and get the actual data behind it, is that scholars tend to have a hyper focus on the influence of Spain and Hollywood, but really mostly Spain, on Latin American cinema. Yet, if we look at it, we would see that Spain has far more co-productions itself than many Latin American countries, as well as France, for example, which is, again, another example of a highly, a country that does do a high amount of co-productions with Latin America. So to give you an idea, 30% of all films made in Spain are co-productions. 50% of all films made in France are co-productions, whereas 17.7% of all films made in Argentina are co-productions, and only 20% of films made in Mexico are co-productions. So sort of my question is, if co-productions bother us so much, well, it's interesting to note that they're actually not as common in Latin America as they are in Europe. The other thing that was interesting to me when I did this section was looking at the lack of, so much interest in Spanish co-productions in Cuba, for example, where we know at some level it's Spanish co-productions that have kept the Cuban film industry on life support, but almost no interest in the period when the Soviet Union was co-producing and investing finances in the Cuban film industry. So I sort of unpack that story. And then also in that section, I'm able to show that we have a hyper focus on what you would call content co-productions, where, for example, you see a Spanish actor showing up in an Argentine movie because there's been investment from Spain at some level. The truth is that 75% of all co-productions are simply financial, and you can't really trace any content consequences to that. The other sort of big part of this chapter is looking at the role of Iberia Media, which gets a lot. Iberia Media is a funding agency where Spain puts money in, and a number of Latin American countries that participate also put in smaller amounts of money, and then film projects apply to Iberia Media for grants. Lots of research on Iberia Media as an example of, sort of the latest version of colonial cultural control. But my research on this shows that it just isn't really as important as folks thought. So you can see in this table how many films, for example, from 2000 to 2009 got released in Europe, and what amount of those were Iberia Media examples. And so again, the thing that you see is that Iberia Media control of Latin American filmmaking just doesn't line up in the way that we think it might. And they only funded 167 films from Latin America from 2000 to 2009. And of those 167, only 47 films circulated beyond the country of origin. And even more interesting, I think, is the fact that many of these films don't even get the kind of distribution that they may not even get circulated at all. And then I sort of move on to a section on distribution, which is, in fact, I will call on folks if they're interested in these things to consider writing more about distribution, because it turns out that distribution is the least studied but most important facet of understanding capitalist control of the film industry. It's really the invisible side of the film supply chain. And so what happened was that nation states in Latin America sort of tended not to develop distribution. They spent a lot of time throwing money at production and maybe protected theaters, but that's another part that I'll talk about in a second. But they really didn't sort of flow through. If we give money to a film, we also should make sure that film gets distribution. What I found was that in the 90s, when we started to see, or actually it starts to shift in the 90s, and then in the beginning of the 21st century, as we start to see substantial changes in the film market, we notice that there are more blockbusters and national films hitting screens in Latin American nations. But it's Hollywood houses that are doing the distributing. And so here's the top 10 distributors in Latin America. It's amazing that there's an almost total control in this case, right? That we haven't really talked about. And so my own argument is that the story of distribution may be the key to understand the ongoing role of Northern hegemony in the region. But the cultural domination, again, is the monoculture of capitalist circuits of production, but not the content value of the objects circulated. This is, again, there's a lot more to this story. It's sort of an interesting piece. I give, for example, here's just a chart that shows, a number of at the time, the top grossing Latin American films and who distributed them. And it's really stunning, I think. It's also important to note that these large distribution companies do a better job of getting Latin American films into theaters. So one has to say, as much as you would want to pull it away from Hollywood, you do have to figure out how to operate within the system. And then the next piece of this, that part of the book, is the part that looks at exhibition, right? Theaters and the film viewing experience. And this sort of draws out of the truth that in the 90s, it made sense to panic about whether or not movie theaters would continue to exist and whether or not there would be just a massive spread to the mega theaters and the multiplexes. Just to give you one data point as an example, from 1990 to 2007, Peru went from 240 movie theaters spread out across the country, 240, to 35 multiplexes that had in total 150 screens. Of the 35 multiplexes, 30 of them were in Lima, meaning there were only 5 movie theaters in the rest of the country that people could go to. Now, that does start to change with an ongoing rise of the film going experience, and my book sort of documents that process. One of the examples that I look at, again, in an effort to kind of overturn paradigm, is the story of the case of Argentina. And Joanna Page, in her study of Argentine cinema, notes that, quote, cinema going in Buenos Aires and other cities has been dominated since the late 1990s by the presence of new and lavish megaplexes owned by North American and Australian companies, chiefly Hoyt's, General Cinemas, and Warner Village. Their location within ultra-modern shopping malls is symbolic of cinema's transformation into a middle-class leisure activity, becoming increasingly associated with the first world aspirations of wealthy Argentines. But here's the thing. The reality really isn't quite there to back up those claims, in part because the film goers are not largely seeing films in these places. So Hoyt's Unicenter and Hoyt's Abasto, which are the two largest multiplexes, which are both in malls, only accounted for 8.63% of all spectators in 2014. And while there was an upsurge in film viewing in Argentina, and of course, Argentina does have a pretty strong commitment to national cinema, only in general, right? Argentines see one film per person in a theater annually. So the other question we might think about is, if that's true, and again, that doesn't mean they saw an Argentine film, how significant is this question of cinema as a source of redefining national identity? And then the sort of next thing that I wanted to bring up in terms of theaters is, like I said, the case of Cinépolis. This image in my slide is awesome, I think, because it's an image of a Cinépolis in India, in Delhi, because Cinépolis was the first the first foreign theater chain to open up theaters in India. They're throughout India. So that's again a case of Latin Americans winning at global capitalism, which again I think complicates this idea of North-South as sort of the paradigm that works. Cinépolis is the fourth largest, as I mentioned, theater chain in the world. It's in 11 different nations and dominates over 65% of the Mexican market. So the second part of my book turns around and looks at the case of place, and then studies, as I mentioned, the three largest film industries in the region, and then sort of tries to dig in and tell the story of what globalization really did do. It starts, of course, with the story of how in Mexico, Argentina, and Brazil, there was a sort of parallel nosedive in the 90s with the era of deregulation. The story, I think, is probably well known to many of you. But then we had this recovery with blockbusters and award-winning films that were seen by national audiences, were seen globally. We saw the rise of internationally recognized directors. And then we saw, sort of, again, there's a lot of interesting things to say in terms of the aesthetics of these movies and the content. It's, of course, no surprise, everyone here, I'm sure, is familiar with this, that, right, the presence of Latin Americans at the Oscars, I think, disrupts the idea of, the idea that Latin Americans are sort of not as successful as those in Hollywood or Europe, right? Emmanuel Lubezki is now the only cinematographer in the world to have won for best cinematography 3 times. We had, Cuarón, González Iñárritu, Del Toro winning best director at the Academies 5 of the last 7 years. So, we had a real moment when it became the case that we couldn't continue to suggest that there was sort of a power imbalance when it came to success across a bunch of metrics. So as I sort of move through the book, I basically say, well, if globalization didn't do what we thought it was going to do to national culture, then, what did it do instead? And so the second part of the book really tries to dig into these deep ambivalences, which, as I argue, are rarely, if ever, dialectical in nature. And that reality makes it extremely difficult to analyze them. And so I suggest that the global era of Latin American film production has produced a series of opposite extremes, increased market diversity and increased market consolidation, increased aesthetic homogenization, and increased aesthetic experimentation. It's also created deep ambivalences within specific film projects, where highly political films are also highly commercial, or where films that are highly national in scope are highly global in success. And again, I'm gonna try not to talk too long so we have time to chat. I just wanna finish by talking a little bit about the very last part of the book, which poses the somewhat cheeky question of whether or not Titanic is a Mexican movie. that last section looks at Runaway Productions, which again, sort of seem to offer themselves up for a pretty facile story about capitalist control of culture, where Hollywood films are not being made in Hollywood, they're being made, let's say, in Latin America. You know, people refer to Mexico as a, you know, filmmaking movie maquiladora. So I wanted to dig into the story, and the background on this is I went down to Tijuana. I was really deeply sort of embedded in the film industry down there. I went and visited Fox Baja, where Titanic was shot. I talked to people who were producers, who were on the set as extras, who drove cars, you know, choferes that were helping with the story. I kept asking them, so what was it like to work on this like Hollywood movie, and did it make you feel bad, and did you care about Mexican cinema? And the questions that I was asking, for the most part, made me look like an idiot. And so it was pretty good, because I kept asking these questions to see if I could get folks to talk to me about this sort of invasion from the North. And again and again, my questions just simply didn't resonate. At the same time, though, the reality was that globalization had really changed the sort of place-making of cinema. And runaway films were a major consequence of globalization. And just to give you a sense of the scope of this shift, right? By 2006, more than half of what we would call Hollywood movies were not shot in the US. And out of the 85 films nominated for Best Picture from 1990 to 2015, only 40 of them had been wholly or predominantly produced within the US. And so again, you know, the story behind Titanic was that, oh, look, Titanic is a perfect example of outsourcing and of using Mexican labor to advance Hollywood itself. But the truth behind this, again, it's not that there's a lot of complexities to the story of Titanic, but what we didn't discover, and what sort of wasn't convenient for that mapping, was the fact that Mexico really wasn't a major source of outsourcing of Hollywood film. And Canada itself, for example, got far more runaway productions. Between Canada and the UK, that accounts for most runaways. And so again, these sorts of arguments that we wanted to have that connected runaways to colonial epistemes didn't really bear out. And so, you know, my research sort of moved on it and started to use the framework of the film Sleep Dealer to help rethink some of the ways in which we imagine the question of runaways, which, if you haven't seen that film, I highly recommend it. It became a good framing device for the closure of this book. And so as I used the film Sleep Dealer, I basically asked, you know, what are the true problems then caused by the globalization of film industry locations? And if I went to Tijuana asking all the wrong questions and focusing on all the wrong problems, what did that experience offer me in terms of giving me a chance to rethink how I could talk about the negative effects of neoliberal capital without being stuck in a series of assumptions that just weren't borne out by the data and by you know, the empirical evidence I could track down. And so my book argues that it's time to change the questions we ask when we think about globalization in Latin American cinema. It's time to disrupt the binaries we rely on and to rethink the cognitive maps we privilege. And that's it.
Wow, thank you so much, Sophia. I think you have summarized such an amazing book that, as I told you, we were trying to read through several of the passages you already presented to us. And there were many questions that were raised during those readings and those conversations, because the amount of information that somehow conflict with our idea of how globalization really had homogenized culture, right? And your counterpoint that is really valid about how it had created also market niche. As a market niche becomes also part of the whole play of consumerism, right? Then is somehow divided and conquer, right? And as making entryways into national cultures, or what we consider used to be national cultures or national industries or national narratives, or regional narratives. Latin America as a region, not as a whatever. That puts us to think about it, right? The question then is, are this or living in the age of global capital, globalization and neoliberalism, that is driven by data, basically, right? And you said that when you are going to look at this phenomenon, you go and try to get empirical data and data that can, back up some of the assumptions, some of your thesis, and then suddenly they are starting to shake. What happens with this data is not available, right? Because the data is also a top to bottom kind of exercise, like the mapping we were talking, right? It's a satellite down, you see a series of, layers, but there is all sorts of invisibilities there. And those are the ones that sometimes we can say, oh, this is not a film that made it to the top 20 or top 50 film watched in Mexico in one of the cineplexes, what Ignacio Sanchez Nacho talks about in his books, right? That's the kind of film production that we should be looking at, because that's the film production happening and being consumed. What happens in the borders, right? In the crevices on the spill outs of this, that also has a series of markets, right? Let's say B movies, or all these commissioned cultural products that get into the black market and are distributed in ways that, can be conceptualized, yes, but not completely taken by this data, right? And that is, they are present there, and they somehow are markers of a globalization that, yes, is hegemonic and is homogenizing cultures. Let's say narco films, right? The whole narco thing that takes place in Mexico, but in Brazil, but in Ecuador, but in Peru, but in Colombia, and that we don't see in cineplexes, or they are not counted as, they don't get Iberia Media's co-production, not even national grants in their, ministers of culture, or, because they live somewhere else in these border, obscure places.
No, I mean, this is a really good question. It's significant, but it's not. So this is the interesting thing. In the book, I sort of trace through a number of examples of what you're talking about, and sort of like these complex webs where you have examples of, say, a film collective. In the book, I talk about Grupo Chasqui and Grupo Comau, and how they've tried to move into digital technologies to continue their work. So it's not as though you sort of have one thing or another, right? And again, I remember one other example of, like, I kept being told not to write this book, right? Jameson told me not to write it. And then I was hanging out with another good friend of mine, Peter Hitchcock, who's a faculty member at the Grad Center at CUNY. He's like, why write about movies? I mean, nobody sees movies. Like, you should be doing video and all the stuff you're talking about. He's like, what you're writing about is completely irrelevant. And I'm like, well, okay, thanks. But the truth is that the film industry itself is only, again, one part of visual culture, right? I'm not making arguments about visual culture writ large. That's massive. But it is still the case that if we find, for example, that we have the scholarly tendency to want to talk about why Spanish investment in Latin American culture is a bad thing. We should find out how often it happens. And it turns out it doesn't happen as often as we pay attention to it, right? In Brazil, you have, for example, far more money coming in from Japan and Sony than you have from Portugal, but nobody's really talking about the Japanese. Why? Because it doesn't flow with that story. And so if, for example, I'm able to show that Spanish investment isn't as much of the market as we thought, that I think matters. It really does change things. And then what I really liked doing was going the other way, right? And finding examples of when Latin Americans are doing the investing, or so then it sort of unravels that flow. And that I do think is again a relevant piece. I talk, for example, about streaming services, and I also talk specifically about some initiatives in Argentina to get ahead on distribution and create new distribution models. So this is just such a constantly moving, complicated, set of connections. But again, they're still working off of scenarios where if it's an Argentine digital distribution model, it's still to stream on what? You have Netflix, you have Blim, you have, you have different platforms, but we can actually get pretty good data on that stuff now. What are people watching on those forms? Does that mean we're catching everything people are watching? No, but it certainly, I think, helps offer a structure, right? I think it's all too easy to say, oh, well, the things I work on don't have data or don't have any, so I don't have to worry about it. It turns out that a lot of film professionals down in various places in Latin America are paying careful attention to this. And I took a lot of initiative from the work of Octavio Getino, who, is such a perfect example of someone who was all focused initially on political filmmaking in Argentina, and then recognized that without keeping good data, they didn't even know what was going on, right? And of course, the other part of the story that I write about a lot in the book is regulations and laws, and what ways the government protects the culture industry, and what are those rules. And that was fun to do all that work too.
Oh yes, no, the archives are there, and they are to be built also. Is like what Gustavo was trying to say about how to build an archive of something that is both transnational, geographically complex, obscure in many ways, multi-genre, and that is not defined. It's our work to do it, right? And that's exactly what you are doing. I mean, in an incredible way, putting all this information together. And we had one question from Rafael Suba that I think you were starting to talk about, that is the impact that internet and streaming is having in Latin American films in particular. Can you expand a little bit more on that?
Yeah, I mean, in the book, I look at a few examples. Frankly, I think the interesting thing is going to be to see what happens now in the COVID era, when obviously people are not going to theaters. I know, and again, this is anecdotal, so that's all I'm working off of, but I tend to watch, most of what I watch is from Latin America, sometimes from Spain, because I miss speaking Spanish or Portuguese. And so sometimes I just consume some really bad stuff because I want to hear the language. But what I have noticed that I think seems significant is more, think of like shows like Casa de Papel, or I was watching this great Brazilian series, or I liked a lot, about a psychiatrist down in Sao Paulo. And like, you're seeing shows that have sort of a political undercurrent, but they're really just sophisticated, highly produced, that's a different era, right? And they are setting a standard at a level that is interesting to me, because I think this is the first time that you see a very vast set of cultural products that are aesthetically interesting, not intellectually sophisticated, but not stupid, and not overtly about politics. And that's pretty interesting to me. And I wonder how that will flow out from there. But I do think for sure streaming is going to become a bigger and bigger issue. As we know, Netflix has played a significant role in investing in some of this, but that's not all, right? I look at, I talk about how in Mexico, they decided to do on-demand viewing of Mexican, golden era cinema. A lot of nation states are attempting to sort of create content access for their citizens so that they can, consume national product. I remember back when I was at Duke, it was sometimes virtually impossible if you were in the United States to get your hands on some of these movies. And now, of course, that's not nearly the complicated, difficult task that it used to be.
Yes, and we have a couple of questions that want to be addressed to you privately, because they go very deep into your research ways. Is 6:52 if one of the panelists or one of the members of the audience wants to do one final question? We're open to that. If not, we'll take 10 minutes and then jump right away to watch La Historia Oficial, that I think opens up a lot of these discussions. And it was great to also start somehow this evening of conversations about Latin American film with the last film of Rivera, and you were also bringing a slave dealer as a very important piece that that we are very proud of, and that has been also shown in the festival several times.
I want to remind everyone too, I was serious. If they're interested in the book, someone I know will be able to provide them with a PDF. And then also, if folks have questions and want to dig into the things I knew, I threw a lot out. I welcome the chance to have these conversations via email or any other social media platform they want. So I don't mind that at all.
Thank you so much. Sophia, it has been a great pleasure to have you back virtually to the Duke UNC non-basketball match, but a common front to think about cultural issues in Latin America. This is the way we start our 35th edition of the North Carolina Latin American Film Festival. Tomorrow at 3 p.m. we'll go again with conversations. We'll have a very important series of panels and films to go. I think Gustavo has a final question. Do you have? No, okay. Then I'm going to share just one little thing with you before we go, and I'll see you at 7 sharp, La Historia Oficial. Thank you very much.